Welcome back to EMS Pizza Politics. In our last episode, we talked about the painful reality of ALS downgrades due to red tape. Today, we aren't talking about the problem anymore. We're talking about the solution. Joining me at the table today is Paul Froman, PhD in leadership with a focus on organization development, educator, the consultant who assisted in the creation of Central Maine Highlands Fire and EMS District Number 1. Paul, we're talking about tearing down borders to share paramedics. In New England, local control is practically a religion. When you first suggest regionalization to town, what is the immediate reaction in the room?
Yeah, it's a like vapor lock a lot of the times. Yeah, kind of have to get past the facial expressions that you get from some folks within the room, and it can really be a combination and just a reactions of loss of local control to someone else is just trying to tell us what to do, and it just immediately makes people defensive, and so you have to spend a little bit of time to realize that we're not trying to take away anything from anybody. We're actually trying to make services better and more sustainable. But there's a lot of education that has to happen to get past that initial emotional response that people have just immediately about, when you walk into a room and everyone goes, I'm here to talk about the R word, and it's regionalization.
It's a dirty
And
word.
people immediately start locking up and almost stop listening. So you do have to spend a little bit of time with these communities. That's one of the biggest things I think I note right off the bat is just you have to spend time having a conversation with these folks to get past that initial of like, why are we here? We're here for this. It'll never work here. And then after you spend a little bit of time, generally people go, oh, okay, I didn't realize that this was a possible outcome of, regionalization. We still have control and the ambulances aren't going away, but it's overall making the system better.
How do you get over that emotional attachment piece where people are wondering, hey, this is a change. Change people have a tendency to be change resistant, right? Unless they know the reasons why, obviously. But how do you get over that emotional attachment of people to say, what's it going to say on the side of the ambulance?
That is a difficult one to get over because partially it's that emotional attachment, and especially they've had the same name for a long time, and there's it kind of goes back to the loss of control that people are worried that they're going to lose their identity, that something is dramatically changing. But at the end of the day, most of these services will see almost no change in the sense of like their culture or their station is still going to be a thing and a need. But yeah, the name on the truck is going to be different. And a lot of times, politicians or members of the service are the ones that are really emotionally attached to this. When we did Central Maine Highlands, I remember we went and had a lot of community meetings, and we all went kind of with this nervous feeling from the committee that it was just going to be very negatively received by the community and like they weren't going to understand this and the change. But I remember this woman stand up and be like, if this is what we have to do to get a response when we call 911, why wouldn't we do this? And someone did ask, like, we don't care what the name of it is, it's ours, and someone's going to come. And it was kind of an eye-opening moment to me. I was like, wow, okay. So, where people were like, people aren't going to accept this. It's going to be changed. We're changing the name. We're changing the model. And overwhelmingly, the community, when it was explained to them, was like, this is what we need to do to have service and a quality service. Because a lot of people do care. They don't just want a service. They want a quality service, generally speaking.
Yeah.
And there's a cost to that. And so it was like these taxpayers were like, we don't care what the name is. It's ours. We want a quality service. And this is what we need to do. Let's do it.
So you said a few things there. You talked about the cost, and I want to come back to the cost a little bit later. But you also said something about culture, and I just want to hit on culture for a second. When we talk about building something new, how do we affect the culture at a department, especially in the reality of, say, a volunteer chief or a very small services fire chief? They're probably burnt out, right? Because they're responding to the calls themselves. They're running the day-to-day operations of the agency, and they're dealing with this, right? With impacts of change, the changing environment. this is in direct relation to the Protecting Patient Access to Emergency Medication Act. How do we address that culture piece and the reality of burnout of leadership?
I mean, regionalization is kind of a step, you could say, to that. And I know there's an immediate thing. There will be less chiefs when you talk about a regional model. If you take 4 or 5 or 6 towns and you put them together and they all had separate entities, if sometimes communities will have even more entities. I know of communities in Maine that have 4 or more agencies that are all separate for one town. They're all private associations. And so when you talk about getting multiple towns to work together, you actually have to factor in that you may even have multiple agencies within one town that you're trying to get to work together. So it's kind of a stepping stone. Culture is a hard thing to change. Leadership is huge. Standards are one of those things. And there's burnout across the board. One of the things that we're seeing in our industry, especially in EMS, and I do believe it is attached to fire as well, but is the fact that we are going from a volunteer model to a professional model. And there is no way, especially in EMS, that there is no way to ignore that fact anymore. The amount of training that it takes to even create an EMT, get them experienced, and to expect them to kind of just sit around, and especially in our rural places, that these people need to work. Economy overall, regardless of the public safety side. So you can't just expect people are going to go get all this training that takes a lot of energy and effort and then sit around at home and provide the service for free anymore. So if we need ambulances, we're going to have to pay people, and that means moving from kind of that volunteer model to that professional model. And every ambulance, or every community in Maine can't afford to put an ambulance there because they have 25 calls a year. So it doesn't make financial sense for that. But if you have 8 communities that all have 50 calls a year, and you can centralize an ambulance and build out that volunteer model, still a very important aspect to have people responding when that ambulance has to come a little bit further, is critical. And also, that's where we share the burden of the financial aspect, that you can build a quality service by working together and share that financial burden of doing it. But going back to the leadership component to it, I can't imagine being a volunteer chief today. It's hard being a volunteer provider today, let alone taking on all the administrative aspects. So when we look at professionalizing the service, and we look at maybe it's time to have a professional chief, and I'm not saying every town needs to have a professional chief as well, because that's kind of one of those things that we see is 8 communities will get to that point where they need that assistance, and we'll all have a full-time chief. So 8 communities have a full-time chief, but still nobody to go on the ambulance. So if you take that same resource, you could hire 8 people that could go on EMS calls and have one person who's doing the administrative side for all of it.
Now you have a fantastic economy of scale, right?
Right.
So let's talk about this fly car model that we had, right? What we're talking about is EMS agencies putting EMTs or advanced EMTs in an ambulance and responding to the call with the transporting ambulance, and maybe a few agencies, or even if it's a single agency, putting together a regional fly car model, which is a paramedic in some sort of intercept type vehicle, usually some sort of SUV. And on certain calls, they'll respond simultaneously with those EMTs to go to that call so that they can provide that higher level of care and even join them in transport if warranted. What's your opinion on that, Paul? Do you think that's a feasible model? And do you know of any models like that in the state that are currently functioning like that?
I do believe that it is a good model to look at. There's kind of 2 factors here. I'd say in Maine, we have 2 problems. One, we have large areas that don't even have an ambulance to go out the door. So as long as we've addressed that issue, and if we do that through building up EMT level ambulance services and sharing that resource of a paramedic, it's a great model. If you have an area that you make sure you have your ambulances, but you're struggling to get your paramedic, because there's a cost to paramedics and wages need to go up for paramedics. So if you go, we can make a lucrative enough to attract a few paramedics to go into this regional model that they're going to be covering calls. They're going to be going to those more acute calls that are more paramedic appropriate. It's twofold. We'll build a more experienced workforce of EMTs that can become very competent at their level, which is an important aspect. And then we don't have as many paramedics sitting around not using their paramedic skills, and they're going on the appropriate calls, so it'll reduce burnout from the paramedic level, and they'll also become very experienced because they're going to be going to a higher volume of calls and not going to the 80% EMT level calls or AMT level calls. So it is a good model. And I hope more people will consider it. Part of it is getting towns to work together. I am aware, I actually just saw a posting a few days ago. The town of Windham and several communities around them are putting on a paramedic car during the day that's going to be responding to, I think it was 4 communities
Yep.
for the ALS model. So I'm excited to see that in southern Maine. But when we look at Maine geographically, like southern Maine and northern Maine have kind of two different aspects. But we're seeing central Maine Highlands, where we had 8 communities, 2 counties participate in a regional project. And then down here now I think we're seeing those stepping stones that we're seeing those communities. They're all kind of still separate, but they're utilizing that. But I think it's hopefully a stepping stone to perhaps do that.
Yeah, from that perspective, I was actually talking with the chief from Raymond yesterday, who's part of that group that's participating in that regional fly car model with Wyndham. They actually pool their resources to establish that fly car model. And they're very, very, very happy with it. They said it's been working fantastic. We can prove that it isn't just a theory. Communities are actually doing it, right?
Yeah. They used sustainability money, which is great, but that's a limited. So like what happens when that resource runs out? And so it's a great step, but at some point someone will be like, well, the fly car and now Wyndham is probably going to be collecting the bill for that. Or are they going to have to start charging the towns around them to maintain that resource for the long term? And so that's where like the district model comes in, that it becomes a taxable entity, and they're all just paying their share, and we break down those barriers of here's the town line, and any reimbursement can go back into the system to create that more sustainable future, whether or not it's average replacement or keeping on those resources. But you are going to be losing the name on the side of the truck, or the
Right.
lot of control. And
The
I hear a lot of times even the chiefs are like, well, I wouldn't be a chief anymore. And I go, well, there's still administrative needs. You might not be a chief, maybe you'll be a deputy chief, or you'll still be a captain in charge of a station. And then a lot of time go, oh, that doesn't actually sound that bad if I don't have to do the administrative side. So once they kind of get over that initial of like, oh, I might not be the chief anymore, like we still need people. Like regionalization is not about reducing the workforce. It's just about redistributing how we do the work.
That's a great point. I know in the total interest of transparency, we've worked on at least one project together. And one of the best things that I heard from a chief at one of these meetings, it was like one of our early meetings, was I'll put my white hat on the table if this will make things better for our communities. And I think that's an example that a lot of leaders could probably take from this and say, hey, I could do that too if I had to. Do you think a lot of local EMTs would fear a regional paramedic system, thinking that, hey, if we put a paramedic fly car, that's going to make us obsolete or is going to chew up EMT jobs?
No, I don't think a regional model will decrease the amount of EMS jobs. If anything, I would think it will probably increase the amount of jobs over time, and like permanent jobs. Uh, we need to move away from a per diem model and start transitioning to more of, again, that professional full-time service. And again, it's hard for a small community that's doing 200 300 calls a year that has an ambulance to justify hiring people. It's sometimes even hard for them to justify a per diem program at that cost for 24/7. So that's just that benefit of, if we work together, we can create jobs, we can create career pathways, which is another component to this. Is you get that 18-year-old college kid who becomes an EMT. They kind of maybe did it because they just felt like, oh, then maybe, I'm interested in this and it would be a good job. And then as a profession, we don't give them an outlet. There's really two ones. They go into the private sector in Maine, and work for one of the hospital-based services, for the lack of other words, or they go into the fire service. And if you're not interested in being a fire officer, or in a small town, there is only so much promotion possibility. So if there's 10 people that are full time and there's a captain, we're both the same age, they just got promoted, like there's no advancement here. There's
Yep.
opportunity within Portland to do things. So like, how does the rural or places that are around Portland do that same thing. Well, if we take 5 or 6 towns that have 40 people each and stations and officers, and we put them all together, now we can start functioning like a larger city, if you will. And I always joke in Maine is we really don't have a large city, saying our population, in most cases, the entire state's population, is still less than some major cities
Right.
that
Yeah.
regional or countywide, response. But it creates a larger, more sustainable workforce that has career pathways. So, and it's not as impacted by 1 or 2 people. So when you have a full-time workforce in EMS of 8 people to have 2 people on an ambulance each day, when 3 people are out or injured or take a vacation, that is a critical loss for that period of time for that EMS agency because half of your workforce is gone. There's no way to impact that. But if you're a larger scale and you have people on vacation or if you have somebody injured, you can absorb that and shift resources around or pull resources to go to training and all those things. But when you're in that small environment, you can't do those things. You can't provide kind of that career pathway and sustainability for just the model functioning correctly in the.
I think people might be afraid to say this sometimes, but even in those those local small towns, right? Um, Sometimes the promotional pathways aren't always intentional, right? And it's inherited or a birthright or something like that.
If you're an association, you still vote. You vote every year on a chief. And I've even witnessed that in a small community where essentially they voted somebody in. He started enforcing the rules that are actually required, and the next year he was voted out
Mm.
because they're like, we don't like you because you're making us do work, or it wasn't as much fun. But the guy was just trying to follow the state requirements, or the
Maintain a
agency
standard,
requirements.
right? Let's
Right, and
let's
that's
keep that
different than
culture thing going.
as we go to the professional side. We have to there is no going back. There are standards that we're going to have to meet, and we need to step forward to be truly proactive in that sense of how do we get ahead of this. Once we can get past all these things, I think there's a lot of cool opportunities for EMS in Maine, but we have to take these first couple steps.
Yep, absolutely, can't agree more. One last question, Paul. Towns really don't like, and I'm going to use a word here, unfunded mandates, right? Towns don't like them. They hate giving money to their neighboring town. So how do you work out that agreement between 8 different communities to say, hey, we're going to do 300 calls a year in this community, but your community is only going to do 200 calls a year. How do we split that cost? How do we figure that out?
Yeah, that there's no golden rule to figuring that out, and every group that I've worked with and built some models for, they all want different aspects. So really, that kind of has to become dependent on the local groups that are working together. Some are very simple, where they just truly are like, let's just look at our populations and that's how much it is going to be. Where some factor in evaluation of property, the number of calls you have, and the population, and it changes every year. So when I go into a community and start having these conversations, the first thing that I do is I just find out where everybody's at currently. Because the question is like, if this community has already invested this much into public safety, and now we pool all the money and we don't look at it from a perspective of, my pot, your pot, but we put it all together. It's amazing how in some cases we've been able to create a model that would increase very little just with the amount of money and resources that are already there. So we have funding collectively enough to staff an ambulance 24/7, which is not the case currently by putting all this money into a pot. And then by beginning transporting, they would start getting revenue. It wouldn't completely offset it. EMS revenue in 911 is, I don't believe in our current future, is ever going to be able to support the full cost of a 911 ambulance system. So there's going to be a component there that taxes for 911 is going to be involved in having an ambulance, which for me as a taxpayer, like I'm okay with that, for a portion of it. But if we can offset some of that cost by having that revenue, and that's going back not into a general fund, but going into a capital account that can be used to offset future purchases, which is that unfunded mandate. If we got to buy something, there's a pool of money here that we can pull it from, and it doesn't come from the taxpayers. And you don't have to go to the selectmen and say, hey, we need $30,000 for, equipment X because the state's telling us that we have to do it. And it would become, a more sustainable model over time. Nobody likes unfunded mandates. And I mean, even with regionalization, that's still kind of that fear of that loss of local control. And someone else will just be telling us what we have to do and what we have to pay. But in a lot of time, I've seen some of the models on some of the projects we have that people could be paying less per capita if we put things together than if we go up. And not always the case. And it's case by case what resources people have and whatnot. But in most of the time, there is long-term financial savings by collectively working together.
Be harder at first, but in the long run, we'll see a benefit from this. Is that what you're trying to sell here, Paul?
Absolutely.
Paul, there's a volunteer chief out there where the administrative burden is so high, we're running out of money. Monday morning, they come into work. What's the first thing that they should do to get themselves out of this hole?
You have to be honest with your decision makers. And I've heard that in meetings that, doing these education processes, when you get decision makers from multiple communities, chiefs in the room, and when a selectman in a meeting goes, I had no idea it was this bad.
That sounds like a fail.
Meetings, right? As I'm going like, where's the communication breakdown of that? Like if you're truly struggling, have you gone to that decision maker? But it's your job as a manager, as a fire chief, you have to continuously be fighting for what you need. And I see it all the time as, well, they said no, so I'm not going to ask again. You have to be consistent in your messaging, because if you go once and say we need this and then they say no and you go away and never bring it up again, was it really that much of a need?
Probably not.
Unfortunately, I think as a chief and a town manager, even as a consultant, like you have to be prepared to say the things that could make someone go, we don't want to work with you. Like you're not going to be the fire chief anymore. We're going to find someone else because you won't listen to us. But your job is for the safety of your community and doing, following the law, doing the right things, which really puts you in a challenging predicament.
Yeah, it wouldn't be called work if it was easy, right? Well, thanks for coming on, Paul. I really appreciate your time today. Folks, hit that subscribe button, turn on the notifications, stay tuned for our next episode. Maybe we'll have Paul back on in the future. And do you want to tell us the name of your consulting company, Paul, so people know what to Google and look up to get in touch with you?
Sure. FromanConsultingServices.com is the website. I'm happy to work with anybody if they have any issues.
All right. Thanks, folks. Stay safe out there, and we'll see you in our next episode.